Hello and welcome to episode 308 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. And Ian, this year is just the year that keeps on giving.
I wish it would stop giving. I don't need it to give anymore. It has given enough.
We've had enough. If it could just
enough has been given.
Take off the rest of the year, that'd be great. If we could just all stay where we are, remain calm, and not do anything until next year. If we make it that far, that'd be good.
At this rate, who knows? It's another episode. It's another discussion of another crash. We begin in Toronto this week with a Delta connection, CRJ-900, operated by Endeavor Air. As Delta has mentioned in every single statement, this was a single aircraft accident.
Okay.
By CRJ-900, operated by Endeavor Air.
That is true. Endeavor Air, much like PSA Airlines, is a wholly owned subsidiary of American Airlines. Endeavor Air is a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta Airlines, in case you're not familiar with the intricacies and weirdness of U.S. regional operators. In this case, it is indeed an entity owned by Delta.
We'll come back to the communication side of things because that's much less important than what actually happened. So what we know so far is based on weather data and video evidence, because there were multiple videos from both.
As close as you could get without being on the airplane. It's actually, no, there is some video from on board the airplane, but yeah, yet again, another incident of another crash that is almost entirely caught on video, which is becoming a trend.
Yeah, I mean, proving once again that AvGeeks are going to AvGeek no matter what.
That's true.
And we like taking pictures and video of aircraft no matter what, even if we're getting ready to pilot another aircraft. So this was Delta Flight 4819 from Minneapolis to Toronto. The flight was landing on runway 23, and the aircraft was landing into a crosswind, into a headwind, into wind of all kind. And as the video demonstrates, the aircraft touched down, I think it's safe to say, pretty hard at this point.
Yes.
Given the fact that the right wing separated from the aircraft rolled with the left wing coming up and over, and the aircraft coming to rest upside down.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack, really aided here by the video that probably shouldn't have been taken, but was anyway, from I think it was the medevac aircraft, actually, that happened to be holding short of the active runway. And one of the pilots, I don't know, an AvGeek, happened to be taking video of a CRJ-900, one of the least interesting aircraft in the known universe, still taking video of it. And it really sheds a lot of light on what happened or what potentially happened. Not why it happened, but what happened. The initial data we saw from NTSB showed quite a hard landing. I think the last data report was over 1,000 feet per minute descent, which at that point is way above what it should be. Would be totally fine earlier on the approach, but for the actual touchdown, that is quite hard. And like Ian, what you said, that the right wing separated. And I think Colleen Mondor actually pointed out that, yeah, when the right wing is broken off, the left wing is still generating lift. And when there isn't a right wing, the left wing is now suddenly very imbalanced aerodynamically, and it just kind of generated additional, or it was still generating that lift. And since the aircraft is no longer symmetrical, it tumbled over to the right.
Yeah. So the miraculous thing here is that every person on board the aircraft, 76 passengers and 4 crew, survived the crash.
76 passengers, by the way, is a full Delta
That's a full flight,
CRJ-900.
yes.
Every single seat on board that aircraft was full, as Toronto and really all of that region of Canada had gone through historic snow levels, and it was extremely windy. So lots of delayed, canceled flight for days. So I'm sure everyone on board that flight was very happy to be on that flight and actually going to Toronto, until they were very not happy to be on that flight.
Yeah. So there were Initial reports varied, but the final tally seems to be 21 passengers were taken to area hospitals in Toronto. And by the following morning, 19 of those 21 passengers had been released from the hospital. It sounds like there are still 2. I haven't seen an update today from Delta on anyone still in the hospital. So it sounds like both of those people remain in the hospital. But the fact that 78 out of the 80 people were out of the hospital by the following morning is just absolutely incredible to me.
Yes, 20 of 21 of the injured passengers have now been released. So there is 1 passenger remaining in hospital. That was as of 10 a.m. Wednesday the 19th, so that may have changed by now. But it is just absolutely outstanding. The end result of what happened is, and I know that we talk about this all the time, and this is something we bring up after every crash of this nature, but the fact that an aircraft could have a hard landing, have a wing ripped off, flip over onto its top, basically, skid down the runway with flames, and then everyone is more or less unscathed and there are no deaths on board is an absolute testament to the industry's safety record, regulations, testing again, certification, testing again of that certification, and wearing your damn seatbelt on the plane. It is absolutely a modern miracle that something like this can happen and more or less everyone walks off board.
Yeah. The investigation is now underway. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada is leading the investigation with support from the US NTSB and the FAA. The Canadian TSB provided an update yesterday, Tuesday the 18th, that the black boxes have both been recovered for analysis. It was, and I'm editorializing a bit here, perhaps the most Canadian announcement and update I have ever seen.
It looked cold out on that runway, but it looked like a very warm Canadian jacket.
They put one of the investigators just in front of the fuselage on the airfield.
Sure, why not? Who needs a podium in the conference room when you could have a runway, Ian? I appreciate it.
Well, okay.
What makes a better backdrop than a very broken CRJ?
I guess I'm not disagreeing with you. But that's what we know so far. We will certainly be following along to understand where the investigation takes the Canadian TSB and what their final report leads to. Let's go to Washington, D.C. and discuss the NTSB's latest update on the midair collision over the Potomac. The NTSB late last week provided an extensive briefing on what they've learned so far based on analysis of the combined flight data and cockpit voice recorder from the Blackhawk helicopter. And here's where we start to get into a lot of the what, but not a lot of the why. So let's kind of follow along with some of the important points on this particular update. The NTSB provided an update, a detailed timeline. I'm not going to walk through that here because we've pretty much gone through that in previous episodes, and it's also posted on the blog that we're keeping for this particular accident. But I just wanted to let you know that they did provide a detailed timeline of what happened, when, and that gets into some of the details about what pilots may or may not have heard during the transmissions with air traffic control. But I'm going to leave that for separate reading. What we know about what some of the FDR and CVR data tells us about the Blackhawk is this. Radar altimeter data says that the Blackhawk helicopter was at 278 feet, and that was a steady reading for 5 seconds before the collision. Previously, the NTSB had said that the CRJ was at 313 feet based on radar altimeter data 2 seconds before the collision.
And refresh our memory, what altitude was the Blackhawk authorized to operate up to?
Where the Blackhawk helicopter was operating, it should have been at a maximum of 200 feet. So this leads us to the second point. There is a discrepancy indicated in the altimeter data that the pilots use to determine their altitude on the Blackhawk helicopter. At one point, the pilot flying states, and this is a previous section of the flight where the aircraft was supposed to be at 300 feet or no higher than 300 feet. The pilot flying indicated the aircraft was at 300 feet. The pilot monitoring indicated that the aircraft was at 400 feet. The NTSB in its briefing says that there was no discussion of this altitude discrepancy between the two pilots. So that's point one. Point two on the altitude discrepancy issue is that the pressure altitude, which is the altitude that would feed into the system, not necessarily the altitude that the pilots are looking at, but the raw pressure altitude that feeds into the primary flight displays. The NTSB, and this is Sean Payne, the vehicle recorder branch leader, saying that this is bad data. Quote, "We are working to determine if this bad data for pressure altitude only affected the flight data recorder or if it was more pervasive throughout the helicopter's other systems." So the FDR captures that pressure altitude. It captured the radar altimeter data, but it does not capture the corrected altitude with local pressure that the pilots would have looked at.
Interesting. We're learning a lot here as we go about what not only a helicopter, but a military helicopter flight data recorder actually records. Because I don't know about you, but I had no idea if these aircraft even had data recorders to begin with.
This is all information that is relatively new to me and adding to some of the pieces that I knew, but it's very interesting to see how development of these recorders has been different amongst commercial aviation and military aviation. And maybe this is in particular a helicopter situation. That I don't know. But we're learning what that recorder is capturing and what it's not capturing. And the NTSB, Sean Payne says, they will know what the altitude the pilot saw was. So they're doing what they do to understand this and find out what the pilots were seeing and to understand if that had any impact whatsoever on the collision. Given what we know so far, probably.
Yep.
But we will kind of continue to follow along with that. A few other things from the NTSB briefing that is new confirmation and new elucidation because it's not quite 100% confirmed, but NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady says that the NTSB believes that the pilots were wearing their night vision goggles. The NTSB now understands that this was a check ride, a combined annual proficiency and night vision goggle check ride for the pilot flying. The pilot monitoring was the person conducting the check ride. And we also now understand that they believe, the NTSB believes that the pilots were wearing the night vision goggles at the time of the collision. Hamady noted that if the pilots had decided to take off their night vision goggles for whatever reason, there should have been a discussion about, quote, going unaided. That was part of the SOPs that is not recorded on the Blackhawk's CVR. And also the NTSB has said that they believe that the night vision goggles were on for other reasons. But that was not specified exactly what. So that's one point there. To the point about the night vision goggles, there was a press question in the briefing about whether or not that would have affected what the pilots saw. Obviously, the NTSB can't give a yes or no answer, but they are going to do a laser scan of the flight decks, both the CRJ, a comparable CRJ and a comparable Blackhawk, to understand what pilots would have seen and been able to see in the context of where the aircraft were. Are they wearing night vision goggles? What can they see? What can they not see when they're looking in various places? So that'll be interesting to see when that finally comes through on the docket.
Yeah, I'm especially interested to see what kind of recommendations the NTSB might put out about the use of night vision goggles in dense, urban, congested airspace like this. I think we're going to learn some quite insightful pieces of information as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. A few other points that the NTSB noted. In a previous episode, we said that the helicopter was operating on a UHF frequency. That is incorrect. I apologize. They were operating on a discrete VHF frequency. What that means, for the purposes of the discussion that we had previously, nothing has changed. What we were saying was that air traffic control could talk to both pilots of the Blackhawk helicopter and pilots of the CRJ. Air traffic control could hear the replies from both sets of pilots, but the two sets of pilots could not hear each other.
There's the most important bit about the discrete frequency, whether it was UHF or VHF doesn't really matter. The fact is that it was a discrete frequency so that the pilots of the Blackhawk weren't able to hear the pilots of the CRJ. So that is yet another piece of the puzzle that makes the operational and situational awareness probably not as high as it should have been if those two groups of pilots in that very congested airspace couldn't have heard each other, because there's a chance that they lost the opportunity to hear the PSA crew confirm what runway they were on. And then the Blackhawk crew could have known that, hey, there's actually another aircraft out here. But Ian, you just said that the Blackhawk crew could still hear the air traffic controllers talking to the CRJ, but couldn't hear the pilots of the CRJ. Is that correct?
That is my understanding of the situation.
I see. Okay. So they would have had some opportunity to hear what the PSA aircraft was doing, but probably not as much as any other helicopter or aircraft operating in that airspace would have had the opportunity to hear.
Yeah.
That's my best guess of what's happening there.
Yeah. The final point that we learned in the briefing late last week was that the Blackhawk was in fact equipped with ADS-B out, but it is not known yet why it was not broadcasting. So the Blackhawk did have ADS-B, but it was not broadcasting. They don't know if it was just turned off. They don't know if it was not working. They just don't know that yet.
Would that have helped in this situation, though? Who would have been viewing the ADS-B out signal other than us, of course? I think we should clarify that this isn't a flight critical thing or a flight safety requirement to have ADS-B out. Can you think of any impact of having that turned off that would have occurred here? Because I can't.
The only thing that I'm thinking of, and I don't know specifically how the display on the CRJ would work, but it would have perhaps increased the visibility of the helicopter to the CRJ. But I would hesitate to say more than that at this point. But it's just interesting to see what comes out of this, as far as also knowing, would that have impacted what the controllers were seeing or the information that the controllers were getting from that aircraft?
Right. Like, would there be more granular information than what radar is returning is a great point.
Right. So that I don't necessarily know for certain.
And I'm sure someone at the NTSB has already asked that very question.
Yes, exactly. Let's stick around the Washington, D.C. area and talk about what has happened within the past week across the federal government, but we're going to focus specifically on firings at the FAA, because there was initially a lot of misinformation about who had been fired and whether or not that had included air traffic controllers or folks that are directly responsible for the safety of the national airspace. That turned out not to be the case.
Not directly.
Not directly. So no air traffic controllers have been fired, but there have been a few hundred FAA employees who were part of this mass cull of probationary federal employees. So folks who had been on the job for less than a year. They were just fired because they were new. And the Air Current did a deep dive into which people at the FAA were fired. And what they found was there were not folks who may be directly responsible for active safety measures. So air traffic controllers, not fired. Folks who are working on radar systems, they were not fired. But folks like maintenance mechanics who may be required to maintain safe access to airfield instrumentation, like an ILS system, people who are reviewing medical and certificate paperwork for pilots and air traffic controllers, IT and telecommunications support professionals who are maintaining the infrastructure that communicates between things like surveillance radars and air traffic control centers, which failed last year and shut down a good chunk of airspace in the Northeast.
Numerous times,
and information specialists. So the people who are in charge of charting. And the crash in DCA reminds us how aircraft routes are charted has a distinct impact on where aircraft fly and how they operate. So these aren't necessarily folks who are on the front lines of active flight safety,
but they make sure the people who are on the active lines of flight safety are able to do their job safely and reliably. We talked a bit before we started recording about how we're going to cover this topic and stay as unpolitical as possible. And this is a really hard topic to do that on because these firings are happening indiscriminately. Some might say randomly without any sort of care of who exactly they're firing or why. It's just the path of least resistance to fire people for no particular reason who are easy to fire. It's not a good look. It's terrible, actually, especially since the FAA has been understaffed for so long. To go in and fire people who you've hired in the last year to backfill a historically understaffed federal agency, some might say is incredibly stupid. Going a little off script here, Ian, because it kind of makes my blood boil, but sticking to the point we're trying to make here, this doesn't make any sense. What are we saving here? What are we trying to do? Especially 2 weeks after a major catastrophe that may not have been caused by any of the positions that have been terminated here, but to what end? Why are we doing this? What's the cause? And what are we gaining? The answer is nothing.
Yeah, I can't disagree with Jason's assessment that the firing of folks who have recently been hired to improve the safety of the national airspace system that has been historically underfunded and understaffed is not a wise decision. And I think, Jason, you bring up this next point. Between recent incidents that have been extremely high profile and some of the things that are happening in government, yeah, people are asking, is flying safe right now?
Yeah. This question has come up amongst my group of friends, amongst people I talk to casually, and random people on the internet have asked me, and I think rightfully so, between the incident in the crash, let's say the crash in DC, the crash in Toronto, and the indiscriminate firings at the FAA, people are actually concerned. Let's put the two crashes in perspective, especially because a lot of people, and of course the media, the mainstream media has picked up on every single little GA accident crash incident that has happened in the last week, because of course they have. But general aviation is no stranger to crashes, incidents, things happening. So I wouldn't read too much into that. But yeah, the two crashes from major US airlines combined with the news hot on the heels of that, of firing possibly safety critical FAA employees, people are uneasy. I myself am uneasy to a degree. I'm not going to stop flying. I'm not going to tell people to stop flying, but I can understand why somebody no longer wants to go to Orlando, to Disney with their family or fly, because they no longer trust the government to provide the service that our taxes are paying for. And if we are just firing safety inspectors, maintenance maintainers, people who are supposed to keep the wheels of the FAA turning, the level of trust is eroded very quickly. I hope we see more out of industry organizations and CEOs and thought leaders to really decry the firing of FAA employees, because it may not have an immediate impact right now, maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually this will catch up with us, not just in the people who were fired today, but in the people who no longer want to work in the federal government and no longer want to be an air traffic controller or a telecom specialist at the FAA because they think they could be fired within the first year, rightfully so. So is flying unsafe? No, but I can understand why people might be second guessing it right now.
Yeah. And that was a point I wanted to bring up that you mentioned with it's not just the fact that people are being fired who have important safety roles, but it definitely tamps down the pool of people who would consider these positions in the future if this is how they're going to be treated. And we want people, I mean, historically, it's been difficult to get people to want to work in government.
Or who want to work, but are put off by the incredibly long hiring process. It is no short ordeal to be hired for a federal job.
This is also true.
So at that point, why bother if the federal government could just indiscriminately fire you, regardless of your performance or your role within the first year, because Elon Musk wants to save a buck or do whatever, swindle the government and fire a bunch of probationary employees who may have actually been fantastic at their job or the future of the agency have now been fired for literally no reason.
We move from one set of firings to another. For the first time in the airline's history.
Kinda, but I'll get to that.
Okay. Southwest Airlines is conducting mass layoffs. Nearly 15% of its corporate staff, about 1,750 people being laid off from the airline. The airline's expecting to save between $200 and $300 million over the next 2 years.
Short-sighted?
Unclear why. So Southwest has been the subject of an activist investor push over the past 2 years. Elliott Investment Management.
And those don't go well.
Not for people, usually, no. Elliott Investment Management has taken an interest in Southwest, saying, hey, this airline could be making a lot more money than it is, which, true, fine. A few months ago, they got rid of a lot of the Southwest old guard that had been around for a very long time. Elliott Management got a few board seats. It sounded like that was going to be that. Southwest was going to make changes, have start with red-eye flights, which started this week. Then they were going to roll out assigned boarding and all of those things. And it sounded like, okay, that was going to be that. And then this week they announced the layoffs. And the take that I find most compelling on this is from our good friend Brett Schneider over at Cranky Flyer, where his point is, yes, Southwest may have had some bloat in staff, but that's probably nothing you couldn't have gotten rid of with some buyouts and attrition, where these kind of cuts, as you're trying to pivot an entire corporate strategy, is a morale killer. And one that does not engender the, quote, warrior spirit that Southwest has been known for, and that they will need to make this a successful transition.
Yep, it's an absolute killer for morale, company-wide, especially given the circumstances here. Yes, all of the layoffs, I believe, were corporate headquarter staff, so I don't believe there were any frontline employees impacted here. But especially now, during this major corporate, not restructuring, but corporate identity crisis that Southwest is going through, they're going to need a lot of people, a lot of successful, smart people to see this through. And I have seen a lot of those successful, smart people already been let go. And it's really unfortunate this is happening at the behest of Wall Street's activist investor firms. So they could pad their earnings, but 15% of Southwest staffs get let go unceremoniously. And I say at the beginning of this topic, kind of, sort of, Southwest's first ever layoffs, because it's only kind of true. Because when Southwest acquired AirTran, it did lay off or let go a number of AirTran employees that were at that point redundant. But they were still technically AirTran employees at the time. But come on, that's Southwest conducting layoffs. So it is not Southwest's first time doing layoffs. The first time probably at Southwest headquarters and to this degree, but out of respect for the employees who were let go at the end of the AirTran era, I wanted to make that known.
That's fair.
Because I work with one every day, and he is great, and Southwest let him go.
All right.
Which is unfortunate, but I needed to put that out there. But it's the first mass layoff.
Judge Reed O'Connor has now set March 14th as the deadline for Boeing and the Department of Justice to figure out what plea deal they're going to try and reach, or this case is going to trial. This stems from the DOJ going back and saying, Boeing, you didn't live up to your deferred prosecution agreement, so now you're going to need to figure that out. Boeing says, okay, we'll plead guilty. They came up with this plan where there was going to be monitoring by an independent monitor that wasn't necessarily going to be all that independent, and it wasn't going to monitor very much. Boeing wouldn't actually have to listen to the monitor. Judge O'Connor didn't like that, but also didn't like a few other things, such as the DOJ abiding by its previous DEI guidelines for who the monitor might be. Then the Trump administration came in. Both sides said, can we have an extra month? The deadline was previously this week. It is now a month from now on the 14th of March. So we'll see what they can come up with and if they can reach a deal. Families of the victims of the 2 737 MAX crashes are saying, hey, don't forget about us. No, the first plea deal basically wiped our memory from what had happened. Please include us this time in whatever Boeing has to do to satisfy this agreement. So we'll see in about a month's time what that new deal looks like.
Or we'll let you know if it's been delayed again.
Well, there's also that.
Speaking of delays.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, see the transition, happy transition. I hope you weren't, Ian, planning on taking delivery of any A350 freighters anytime soon.
I was. I have 27 on order.
Unfortunately, that won't be happening, at least for, a year beyond originally expected?
At least.
And who do we have to blame for that?
Spirit Aerosystems. Wow,
they're everywhere.
They are. So this comes from Airbus working through its statement of year-end financial statements for 2024 and forward-looking statements for 2025. They're delaying both the first flight and introduction into service of the A350 freighter and also the rate increase for the A350 passenger version. So they were targeting a rate increase beyond 6 aircraft per month on the A350 line, now going up, well, not going up, but still targeting 12 by 2028. So we'll see if that happens.
And this is the part of Spirit Aerosystems that now is owned by Airbus, I reckon. So really will be owned. So this will become a problem that Airbus itself can deal with more directly. Not quite yet, but for right now, it could still blame Boeing.
I guess, yeah, they can. Let's go to Canada, Jason.
I love Canada. Canada's great.
Where last week, Lufthansa Technik had a monumental announcement in Calgary.
That's true. Their words.
Monumental.
Not our words. Their words.
Their words.
Yes. It
was such a great press release.
It may have been overblown, but I got a press release on February 12th from Lufthansa Technik saying, we're going to have a monumental contract and an exciting partnership in Calgary, Canada. They even had a nice rendering of the Calgary skyline with an engine cloud rendering thing, which was nice. So that was a bit of a hint. But what did they actually announce?
Lufthansa Technik is going to spend a ton of money and get quite a bit of money from various Canadian governmental organizations to build a massive facility to take care of all of WestJet's CFM LEAP 1B engines. So the airline has 50 and 50 on order. So that's times 2, that's a lot of engines. And I assume at some point this will also perhaps include other airlines' CFM LEAP 1B engines, perhaps also in Canada, who knows? But this is the first time that this maintenance package will be performed by Lufthansa Technik in Calgary, keeps things close to home for WestJet, which I know they're excited about, and also puts a ton of money into the airport complex and folks in.
And a lot of good paying jobs, too, in Calgary. These are highly technical. I mean, it's called Lufthansa Technik, but these are good jobs. So monumental may be a bit of an overblown statement, but it really is kind of a big deal.
It's a big deal. I would not necessarily have called it monumental, but it's definitely great news for both Lufthansa Technik and WestJet.
I think Lufthansa Technik should invite us out there when the facility is open to judge for ourselves how monumental it is. What do you think?
How monumental? We should definitely do that. So construction starting this year with completion by 2027, and then you'll start to see engines come off the wing then. So looking forward to seeing that.
Cool.
Also cool, Air Greenland is deciding that they need another jet. They're going to lease an A320neo from Carlisle Aviation Group in December of 2026, with delivery expected in December 2026 for the 2027 summer season. So this aircraft will mostly operate on the Copenhagen-Ilulissat route, so to the north, on the western coast north of Nuuk. And that'll be cool because it's what did we figure out? The fourth ever jet that Air Greenland has ever operated.
So we did some deep research before we hit record on Air Greenland's previous jet fleet. And we all know the somewhat troubled now A330neo. We know of this new A320neo. We know that the 330neo replaced the 330CO. But we both did not know that in the past, Air Greenland had actually operated a leased Iceland Air 757 back up until, I think, 2011 or 2012. So I had no idea.
2010.
2010, even earlier. Wow.
Is when it stopped. And now it's still flying. It's been converted to cargo and I believe operates for one of the DHL subsidiaries.
Cool.
Yeah. So there you go. Operated by DHL Austria.
Nice.
There you go. Yeah, so looking forward to that one. Sticking in the far north, Air Baltic has taken delivery of its 50th A220 last week, registration YLABX. That aircraft bears a special Baltic heritage livery, Latvian heritage livery, very cool looking special livery. That aircraft, while the airline's 50th, still doesn't take it up to enough aircraft in the fleet to not need wet lease capacity for the summer season. Because as we all know, you could be flying on one airline and be 4 airlines removed from the aircraft you are actually operating on come high summer season in Europe. So we have a first confirmation of what the summer season is starting to shape up with. Carpet Air will have 2 A319s and an A320 operating for Air Baltic. So looking forward to see what else shakes out and looking come June, July, what manner of strange wet lease operators are flying around for Air Baltic and where Air Baltic aircraft are flying for other operators. So that'll be fun.
Yes. For those keeping score at home, while Air Baltic is now up to 50 deliveries, apparently, according to planespotters.net, only 37 are actually in service, leaving 13 inoperable or parked for whatever reason. So we'll let you know when the in-service number hits 50. So check back in 2027 or so.
Yeah. So a few episodes ago, Jason,
yes,
we got kind of excited
I love getting excited.
about Air Canada bringing back the 767. And as it turns out, surprisingly, really, things got better for the airline, and they might not need those 767s this summer after all.
Maybe, maybe not. We're not quite sure. So Air Canada was, I think, February 1st had inserted into the schedule the resurrected 767-300ER. It pulled them out of the desert. They are currently in Hamilton, Ontario, being worked on. But that didn't happen. Apparently, it takes a lot of effort to refurbish and put back into service a 30-year-old 767 that's been rotting away in the desert since the onset of COVID. Apparently, they've had some mechanical issues with it. We're not really quite sure why, but in some sort of panel that I happened to get some video of today, an employee asked about the 767s, and it turns out that maybe by May or June, we'll see them put into the schedule, and they won't be permanent, but maybe May or June, but also maybe not, because apparently, and Ian, you might gasp, and listeners, you might not believe me, but they say that Pratt & Whitney is catching up on their A220 GTF engine issues to the point where they may not need these 76s after all. Imagine that.
What?
Yeah, so these 76s were brought back because they had a lot of A220s grounded, and they were very short on fleet last summer. They're still short on fleet. So they had a couple 76s hanging around. They thought put them in service, but maybe, after all, it just might not be worth it, or they might not actually need to, or a combination of the both, which would be disappointing. I was thinking about going out and catching a flight on one of these Air Canada 76s, but I might have to go to China instead.
Go on.
So, with absolutely no confirmation whatsoever, and it's almost certainly a scheduling mistake, Air China has actually put the 767-300ER back into its schedule starting March 1st. And that has to be a mistake because it doesn't have any 767s left, and it retired them in like 2011 or something like that. But they're there. They're in the schedule. You can find them on flights on airchina.com, and they will even link you to the seat map of the 767s. It's almost certainly a mistake, some sort of old filing.
Somebody pressed the wrong button.
Somebody hit a 76 instead of a 77. But if Air China brings back the 76, hey, that would be very exciting too, because I have no idea where they would be pulling one from.
Huh. Other fleet replacement news, Finnair is finally considering replacing some of its A320 family aircraft. We talked about this, I don't know how many episodes ago, but Finnair has famously refused to partake in the Neo thus far. They have a not quite ancient, but elderly fleet.
It ain't new.
A319s, A320s, and A321s. 4/5 of the 5 A319s are 24 years old. All of the A321s are over 20 years old, and the oldest is 24. A321s, comparatively new. Only 2 of those are over the age of 20. So Finnair's leadership this week says they're looking at some final calculations on replacing 15 of the oldest members of its A320neo family. As previously discussed, this non-renewal of the fleet has fared Finnair pretty well because they haven't had to deal with any of the Pratt & Whitney GTF engine issues.
Yeah, look at that. Procrastination pays off. It always does.
So we'll see if they go with the GTF. I'm obviously assuming they stick with the A320neo family, which I think is a fairly benign assumption. So then you have your options of you got your Leap 1A or you have your Pratt & Whitney GTF, and we'll see which ones they choose. So keep your eyes open for a new tender for the Finnair fleet. And finally, this week, you could help JetBlue pick its next new livery.
Yes. We love contests, specifically
we do.
Contests that involve helping an airline pick its next special livery. JetBlue, already well-versed in the art of special liveries. They probably have more than any other airline that I can think of, at least.
I mean, as long as we're like not counting Frontier.
Well, every aircraft at Frontier
That's what I'm saying.
Special.
That's what I'm saying.
If you're excluding Frontier, I get more jet tip alerts for JetBlue than any other airline because they have so many specials. But now they are letting You pick, they very specifically put you in capitals, pick the next special livery that celebrates Puerto Rico, which is pretty great. There are 3 distinct, already mocked up liveries, one called the Stencil Network, another from artist Elizabeth Barreto, and the other from Tubeline, which is interesting, with long descriptions about how each one ties itself back to Puerto Rico. I voted for the Elizabeth rendering because it has sea turtles on the belly of the airplane, and I think that's pretty great. But you should vote for whichever one you think is the nicest.
I'm having some real trouble here because I like all 3 of them. I've narrowed it down to my top 2, but I have not yet been able to choose which one I really want to vote for. So let us know either in the comments in the show notes or in an email to podcast@fr24.com which one you're most keen to see. Or with anything else you want to talk about and let us know about, comments, questions about this week's episode, previous episodes, what you want to see on a future episode, let us know. Email us at podcast@fr24.com. Or if you listen to the podcast or read the show notes to the podcast on the Flight Radar 24 blog, we do have the comment section there so you can engage in not only comment and question to us, but with other listeners if you so choose. So have at you there. This has been episode 308 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.